Jackie. We're going to talk about accommodations today, and with me is Amanda Danks, who's going to be leading us through all kinds of stuff this morning. I'm trying to find my participants button here. We are. And then right click. There we go. All right, I'm giving Amanda the reins. Okay. All right.
You ready to start?
I am ready. Sound is working, but it's very quiet. Okay, well, I'll let Amanda see what happens. Amanda, go for it. We'll see how your voice sounds. We should be
here so that it's on hands-free.
Should be hands-free right now.
But maybe it's pushing it somewhere else. So.
Don't lose it.
Should be pushing hands-free.
There we go. Okay, is the sound any better now? Yes. Awesome. Okay, perfect. Well, good. All right, and all right. So again, good morning. My name is Amanda Danks. I work in accountability services with testing policy and operations. And in that role, I handle the accommodation policies and guidance for students with disabilities and students who are English learners. And so what I'll go through today are the accommodations for students with disabilities, and then we'll briefly touch on the accommodations for students who are English learners. The reason for that is that all but one are the exact same. So, so that'll be easy for us to glance through that. Where I always like to start is by showing where this presentation is found so that everyone is aware that it's not super secret information, but information that everyone has access to. So like most people, I often just go to Google to find things. So if I go to NCDPI, accountability, and if I click that in, the first link, accountability and testing results. So of course this isn't what we want, but down here on the left side, you can see testing students with disabilities, and that's where this presentation is housed. And let me make this a little bit bigger for you. There we go. Okay, and then down here under presentations, we'll see the PowerPoint presentation to review accommodations, and that's the one we're going to do today. So again, I just go through that to let you know where it is, so that you don't, so that if you need to reference this later, or if you're doing a training, or sometimes, you might need to justify a decision that you've made, that way you know where this information is. So the Testing Students with Disabilities, this is an overview of the 2017-18 publication. Again, my name is Amanda Danks, and my email address is right there. Also my phone number, and we have a slide to go over that at the end, but just while we're thinking about it, my phone number here is 919-807-3781. And yeah, okay, great. So the purpose of this presentation is only meant to highlight the key points and some changes that have happened to this publication over the last year. Of course, for students working directly with students, or if there are any questions, this presentation should not replace a full reading of whatever sections you may have questions about in the Testing Students with Disabilities publication. And actually, while I'm thinking about it, if we go back one, on this webpage, you see up here where it says, 2017 Testing Students with Disabilities North Carolina Testing Program, and that's where this publication is housed. So the presentation and information we're about to go through all comes from this document right here that is also found on that same webpage. Sorry. There we go. So the purpose of this publication, and again, that's the Testing Students with Disabilities document, is to provide guidelines and procedures for accommodations used during testing. And it also provides guidance for students with transitory impairments, and that is an impairment that is expected to last 6 months or less. So this could be something like a broken arm or a broken leg, or I don't know, kids do crazy things. So that could be something that we expect to only last about 6 months. When a student transfers, we need to honor the current IEP from out of state. The IEP team is required to provide those comparable services until an evaluation can be performed to determine if the student is eligible in North Carolina and a new IEP is developed. All accommodations on that current IEP must be honored. So even accommodations that, according to our policies, would violate the construct of the test and invalidate the results, if it is on that student's current IEP, we must honor it. And I know that's a question that comes up a lot. Joint responsibility, of course, we always recommend teamwork makes the dream work. Working together at the LEA level for the test coordinator, the EC director, the Section 504 coordinator, and then you all as Power School gatekeepers are certainly a part of that to be sure that we have these accommodations logged where they should be. And we just want to highlight test administrators play an essential role in this effort. And so as I go around virtually around the state, doing more webinars these days, to present this information, what I have done this year is I'm just presenting the exact same slideshow and showing everyone exactly where it is. I want to be sure that everybody has all of the same information, and then we can always ask questions as they arise. Participation in assessments falls under one of these three categories. A student can either take the general test under standard conditions, meaning no accommodations. The student can participate in the general test with testing accommodations, or the student can participate in the alternate assessment with or without accommodations. Something new this year is the North Carolina Accessibility Framework. And so this consists of 3 tiers of accessibility supports that are available to students in both instructional and testing situations. Those 3 tiers include universal design features, designated features, and accommodations. So we'll go through each of those 3 levels right now. Universal features are things that are put into place at the design phase of our assessments. These are available to every student regardless of IEP, 504, or EL status. These include a calculator for those assessments that require a calculator, breaks at predetermined intervals, the use of scratch paper and pencils with erasers, graph paper for math tests, and our tests are written using plain English. And plain English is that language that we select with an emphasis on being brief and clear and to avoid complexity. So the next level, the next tier in the North Carolina Accessibility Framework are the designated features. These are features that are also available for use by any student, regardless of 504, IEP, EL, or transitory status. Every single child is able to use these if the teacher or team determines that they're needed. These things can be embedded or provided digitally, embedded and provided digitally or provided locally, and you'll see why that may be the case when we look at the next slide. Students, of course, need to have experience using these designated features. If we have no experience using them, then it could be unfair for that student on test day. And for students with IEPs or Section 504 plans, these features should be documented in those respective plans. And the reasoning behind that is if a student needs one of these designated features in order to allow access due to a disability, then we need to have those documented in their respective plan. So it comes down to the difference between a preference or a need. And so you'll see in the next slide when we talk about these. So these are split into online and paper pencil administrations, and some of them, of course, span both. We have highlighters, a reading tracker, color contrast, adapted mouse, adapted pencil, preferential seating within the classroom or adaptive seating. Adaptive seating can be those things like a ball chair or a wiggle cushion or a standing desk. Test directions read aloud in English. And redirection. Now, all of these are explained in the Testing Students with Disabilities publication in more detail. So if you have questions, you can certainly go to that, or we can talk about those now. But again, if a student needs these in order to access the assessment because of a disability, so if a student has a visual impairment and requires that color contrast in order to access the assessment, then that would be something that needs to be documented in an IEP or 504. For example, though, if I just prefer to have a yellow background with black font, then that, and I don't have an IEP or 504, then that would not need to be documented. So the next tier in the North Carolina Accessibility Framework are accommodations. And these are changes in the materials to ensure that each student has equitable access in both instructional and assessment situations. Accommodations are only available for students with a current IEP, Section 504 plan, transitory impairment documentation, or an English learner plan. So whereas universal design features and designated features were available to anybody and everybody, accommodations are only for those students with those plans that you see listed there. The decisions about accommodations must be made with the best interest of the student in mind. And I outline that in red because I know sometimes we hear about maybe some pressure to make different accommodations decisions to accommodate scheduling for adults or a variety of adult needs. We need to be sure that we're making these decisions based on student needs. So the Council of Chief State School Officers, or CCSSO, has developed this lovely little graphic, which is included in the Testing Students with Disabilities publication and is a part of our North Carolina Accessibility Framework. And this 5-step decision-making process that's outlined here, I thought it was just a good thing to add to all of our publications because it really helps us think through what the student needs and how to make that happen. So everything we just went through with the North Carolina Accessibility Framework is included along with the descriptions in every assessment guide. And so we're hoping that that will help draw attention to those universal design features and designated features to help teachers and students understand the options that are available. So I just want to pause real quick at this point to see if there are any questions about the North Carolina Accessibility Framework before we jump into accommodations.
Okay, guys, don't be shy. Must be these people are all good to go.
There we go. Sounds good to me.
So we got one. Does all the information come in from Easy IEP?
So the way the information flows, and you might actually know more about this than I do. Okay. So the third-party IEP vendors, that information goes to CCAS, and then CCAS provides it to accountability to be automatically put into our testing platform.
However,
right?
now CCAS is they're working on another ECAS now.
I have a very long meeting about that tomorrow.
Right. So does all the information come in from Easy IEP? I'm not sure all.
Yeah, the accommodations do. So if the student has an IEP, which I assume the answer is yes if we're using Easy IEP, the accommodations information would flow from Easy IEP eventually to us. It just, I guess what happens behind the curtains may not be all that important.
Right. Let's go eventually.
Great. Any other questions before we move along? Okay, great. So if any come up, just go ahead and type them in, and then we'll find a good spot to pause and answer as many as we can. So testing mode options. So all of the North Carolina assessments this year are offered both online and paper pencil, except for the NC Extend one, which is the alternate assessment. A student with a documented need, so again, this comes down to that documented need in order to allow access, not a preference. If a student has a documented need in an IEP or Section 504 plan, he or she can use online or paper pencil of any North Carolina test. So even if there is a district who has said, we are going 100% online, if there is a student who has it documented in his or her IEP that a paper pencil assessment is more appropriate, then that student must receive that paper pencil version. And then the inverse of that, of course, would be true. So if there's a documented need in the IEP or Section 504 plan, then the student can take whichever mode suits their needs. Teams should also be sure they're considering all of the accessibility and accommodations options when making this decision, because perhaps one of those accommodations would allow the student to take the mode of assessment that the classmates are. So general information about accommodations, they must be documented in the student's IEP or Section 504 plan, and they must be used routinely in the classroom, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a minute. Accommodations typically fall into one of these three categories, either a special print version, an assistive tech device, or a special test arrangement, and a special test environment. And of course, we know anybody working in EC, you know well that students may require a combination of multiple accommodations, and they can certainly have that. So for the special print versions, these are the approved accommodations, a Braille edition, and we're going to go through each of these. Large print, one test item per page, and then the combination of those last two, large print and one test item per page. These are the approved accommodations for AT devices and special arrangements. And like I said, we're going to go through each of these, and special test environments. So this order is kind of the hierarchy that we would use when we're thinking about accommodations. So the IEP is at the top, Section 504 plan, EL plan, and then a transitory impairment plan. So what that means is, if a student has an IEP and an EL plan, all of the accommodations to address that student's English learning accessibility needs must also be included in the IEP. So everything kind of works from the bottom up. Any changes in testing accommodations? So this happens, and accommodations can and should be used and changed as appropriate in order to meet the needs of each individual student. It is a best practice for students to have at least 30 school days to become familiar with using an accommodation. So I just want to, let me see, yes, okay, good, I have it in a red box. It is a best practice for students to have at least 30 days. So most times, and this is what I explain to a lot of our testing folks, most times if a student, if accommodations are being put in student's IEP or 504, he or she has used them in the classroom, and the teacher or the team has documentation to show that those are needed in order for the student to access the assessment. So for example, if I had an IEP meeting today, chances are, now we can't be sure unless we talk to all the right people, but chances are I've already used those accommodations in the class, and the team has said, yes, this student has used the accommodations, and so we're going to put them in the plan. There is no 30-day deadline or cutoff for changes in accommodations, and I can't stress that enough. I know in the past there may have been the words 30-day deadline and accommodations used together, but there is no 30-day deadline or cutoff for changes in accommodations. IEPs, 504s, EL plans, they happen anytime, all the time, and the goal is to support access for instruction and assessment for that student. So there is no 30-day deadline. What is in the IEP on the day of testing must be provided. So are there any questions about that before we move on from this slide? I know in some of the trainings I provide, this is a hot topic.
So how often do you have IEP meetings? So if I have a meeting with a parent and team, when does that IEP stipulation go into place? Is that like that day? Do they have?
Whatever the date. Yeah, it's usually the day of the meeting, but that's not always the case, but usually it is. Yep.
Okay. We do have a question. Why is the wording in the TSWD and LEP handbook for 30 days if there is no such thing?
So again, just going back to, and in the testing, in both of those guides this year, there is no 30-day deadline language in there. It says that it's a best practice for the students to have 30 school days to become familiar with using an accommodation. And so that is very different from saying that there's a 30-day deadline.
Okay, so it's stated as a best practice in the newest version.
Both this year and I believe last year. There's no 30-day deadline. It's just that it's a best practice for students to have at least 30 school days. Okay, any other questions about this slide? Okay, so again, if anything else pops up, we'll address it as we are able to. So there are sometimes accommodations that a student needs and typically uses in the classroom that may not be listed or spelled out in the Testing Students with Disabilities publication. If that's the case, that's great. Then the student must use, then the test coordinator would submit a special accommodation request as soon as possible. And what happens is in that document, they explain what the student needs, for what tests that accommodation is needed, why what we already have doesn't cover it. And then that comes to me, and then we look over that and provide the school with a response as to whether or not that accommodation is allowable. So some examples of that could be just anything a student needs that's not listed. So like just last week, I received two requests to use a service animal. Someone requested their test to be printed on blue paper. Things like that are not specifically defined in our documentation, but using this process, we can allow for those accommodations.
Okay, we do have a question. What if an IEP change happens after a deadline for ordering and then we can't get the large print CD or whatever?
So TOPS, Technical Outreach for Public Schools, they are our publishers, and they have a 24-hour turnaround. So yeah, so that should certainly be a rare exception and not the rule. And we will provide my contact information again at the end, so if something like that comes up. Pre-ACT, I see a question about that. So it sounds like, you know, if a student's IEP changes and he or she needs a different version of the pre-ACT. So because that is a vendor assessment, I have a lot less sway or control over that, and so that would need to be something addressed through them. And they may actually even have some explanations on that in their guidance, but we don't, that's a vendor provided assessment.
The pre-ACT.
Mm-hmm. So again, the special accommodation request, just a little screenshot of that is right here, and this is available online using the Testing News Network system. And test coordinators have access to this, and then this comes straight to me for me to work through the approval process. Okay, so now we're going to jump through each accommodation. And again, please feel free to ask questions as you think of them. So Braille editions need to be entered into so this is a big way of saying either IEP or Easy IEP or CCAS or whatever third-party vendor. When we say LEA approved accommodations management system, I think you all probably know better than some of my other groups that I present to what that means. So EBAE and UEB, those are two types of Braille. What we've done this year is put those options on the IEP page itself. The reason was that in the past, at the IEP team, they would just select Braille, and then the test coordinator had to order the type of Braille. Well, sometimes that test coordinator may have no idea who that student is, or no understanding of what Braille code is, and no understanding of what the two different Braille codes are. And so to take that possibility of error out, at the team meeting on that day, they would be selecting which type of Braille. If a student needs uncontracted Braille, that would be ordered through that special accommodation request process. The large print edition. So the standard large print, so the standard tests are printed on 8.5 by 11 paper using 12-point Verdana font. That's how regular tests come. If a student needs a large print edition, that would come on 11 by 17 paper, and that uses 22-point Verdana font. This can be ordered on TNN. This is not anything special. The large print one test item per page, so that combination of those two, that's also in 22-point Verdana font and can also be ordered off of TNN. So any large print or large print one test item per page editions that are not described here, that are not exactly what is here, those can be ordered using that special accommodation request. So we have some students, for example, who need 32-point font, or they need, just any different font that's not listed here, then they can order it, they can submit that special accommodation request. So we never want to say that, oh, we can't provide that size font, because chances are we can. And if we cannot, then after they have submitted that special accommodation request, I can call them to kind of troubleshoot and see if there are some other things we can do to support access for that student. One test item per page is exactly what it sounds. It'll be one test question on each page. It'll be on an 8.5 by 11 page and be 12-point Verdana font. It's important to note that this is printed one side and comes unbound. But again, if a student needs that one test item per page and large print, they can order that off of TNN. AT devices. There are every year more and more AT devices that are available for our students with disabilities to promote access, which is wonderful. And so each year, this is probably the section I would say that gets the most refreshing. So just in general, the test administrator needs to be sure that whatever AT device they're using is compatible with our online system and is up and ready in working order. Any files that are saved on the equipment must certainly be deleted afterwards. And the following is not an exhaustive list, but examples of each type of AT device. If there are any questions, please contact your regional accountability coordinator, or you can call me to know if what a certain student is using is allowable within the AT device world. So some low-tech devices, clipboards, dry erase boards, Dyson non-slip mats, slant boards. So again, none of these need a special accommodation request. These are all approved accommodations already. And also this, just to repeat, this is not an exhaustive list. Sensory techniques, those can include anything from chewing gum to noise-canceling headphones, weighted blankets, or hand fidgets. Amplification devices, special lighting. Some students require a special bulb or a certain level of brightness within their testing area. Glucose meters and insulin pumps. So we do have a lot of students who require a glucose meter or an insulin pump. Of course, they need to have those in testing. And technology is amazing. And so a lot of times now students have these devices that require a cellular device to communicate with whatever grown-up is around about insulin or sugar levels. And so that is certainly allowable during testing and instruction. We just want to be sure during testing that that cellular device is kept away from, kept away from other students and not used for any other reason other than to communicate with that monitor. Students are able to use speech recognition systems, talking word processors, keyboarding devices or alternative or customized keyboards, screen enlarging programs or accessibility operations within a computer. Another type of AT device could be the audio tapes to record a response, and then the student would scribe or transfer the responses. Eye gaze device or software. An interactive whiteboard. For that, we do recommend the student must be tested in a one-on-one setting. Calculators, There's a variety of ways that calculators can be made to support access. So just in general, just to recap, the use of any AT devices, we want to be sure that if the student is taking the online assessment, that whatever they're using is compatible with the NC Test Chrome app or the secure browser or the iPad app. Even things like adaptive mice sometimes, or mouses, I don't know what the right, mice, there we go. Sometimes those, for whatever reason, even though we think of it as just a mouse hooked into a computer and it should work the same as any other mouse, sometimes the adaptive mouses do not work for whatever reason. So it's just always good to try that stuff out. And you can do that on the online tutorial or the online released items for any of our assessments. Dictation to a scribe is another one of our accommodations where a student is able to dictate his or her response to a scribe who then records those responses. Obviously, with this accommodation, we would want the student tested in a one-on-one setting so that no other students can hear their work. So we just want to take a pause right here to look at tests that measure reading comprehension, because that distinction is going to be important as we move forward in these next few slides. So these are the tests that measure reading comprehension. And so if a student has interpreter, transliterator, signs, or cues the test, using this accommodation invalidates the test, a test that measures reading comprehension. And so if you think back to one of our first slides, we say that any student who whatever accommodations a student has when he or she transfers in to our school or district, we must provide. And so some states, they allow read aloud, or they allow an interpreter or transliterator to sign or cue the test, even if it does measure reading comprehension. So if that's what is on the student's current IEP, then that's what we must provide. But it will invalidate the test. And so that's a conversation that typically an EC coordinator or a 504 coordinator would have with the family. For a paper pencil test, the interpreter or transliterator is able to review the test a few days ahead of time under secure settings and make notes as needed. For an online test, the online forms are randomly selected. So it is very helpful to have an additional monitor that would duplicate what the student is seeing so that the interpreter or transliterator can sit across from them, see the same thing, and provide that service. If a student has the accommodation to mark their answers in a test book, then that student would not receive an answer sheet. And the test administrator, under a secure condition in a group setting, would transcribe those answers. If the student needs the accommodation of reading the test aloud to him or herself, then that student would be tested in a one-on-one setting to be sure that other students cannot hear. This is really hard as a test administrator or a proctor, but we cannot correct the student as he or she reads aloud. Which I know a lot of times is second nature, but we have to kind of turn that off. Tests are read aloud in English. So this is one of those accommodations that would invalidate an assessment that measures reading comprehension. So those of you who were here last year or have been around prior to that, it used to be computer reads test aloud or test administrator reads test aloud. And so the problem with that was that IEP and 504 teams were essentially being asked to predict, sometimes more than a year ahead of time, what type of tests the district would be giving the following year. And in reality, whether the computer reads the test aloud or the test administrator reads the test aloud, the student is still receiving the same thing. The test is still being read aloud. And so what we did is we collapsed those into one. And it's now the test read aloud in English. And in CCAS, third-party vendors, in PowerSchool, you'll see the test read aloud accommodation and then a box where the team can describe what the student needs. And so maybe they need a combination of the computer and a test administrator. Maybe they need, only if they ask for it to be read aloud, then the test administrator can read aloud. Maybe they need the computer to read it aloud and they can use headphones, or maybe headphones are annoying to them, so they need it read aloud and they cannot use headphones. So whatever the description is, there is a spot for that.
We do have a question. Is that note on the ROA?
Is that noted on the review of accommodations form? Yes, and that is, and I will open up another page here just to show that. So again, testing students with disabilities. We can go here to testing accommodations. And I did ask for this to be updated, so I hope that it's here. Review of accommodations used during testing. And let me blow this up. Yes, so right here we can see test read aloud in English specify. So that is on the review of accommodations form. Yep, good question. Great. So a lot of this guidance remains the same. The test administrator can read the test aloud, or the computer, or both. The student can have everything read aloud. They can have to request. They cannot need it read aloud on math. And that would all depend on the student, and that would be specified in their respective plan.
Okay, we do have one more question. This is probably more of a Jackie question. Our people have been trying to enter accommodations in PowerSchool. However, the last 4 or 5 options, starting at keyboard devices in the available accommodations box, are not able to be clicked. I have already entered a ticket. Okay, Melissa, I'm glad you entered a ticket. I have not heard or seen that as an issue yet, but I'm pretty sure that that ticket's going to end up with me anyway. So thanks for the heads up, and I'll look for it, but I have not heard anything about it yet.
Great. Just something to note, and again, I'm not sure if this would be relevant to you all, but just in general, if a student is using the computer to read the test aloud, it's human vocalization, and it's a man voice, a woman voice, so sometimes the volume and the pitch can be different, and so if a student is sensitive to those things, then you know, it may be important for that student to have a different way for the test to be read aloud. And there are also no audio files within the test environment for error messages or warnings or graphs or tables. Braille writer and slate and stylus / Braille paper. It's recommended that the test administrator have knowledge of those applicable Braille codes. An abacus, we want to be sure that only the test administrator is using it and that it works.
How about that?
Usually those belong to the student, so we want to be sure it works. A magnification device, again, if the student is using his or her own magnification device, which is not uncommon, then we need to be sure that the student brings it and that it's working. Multiple testing sessions. This allows the total test time to be divided into mini sessions as needed by determined by the needs of the student. If this accommodation causes the student to have testing breaks that differ from those designated in the assessment guide, then that student must be tested in a separate room. And I will show you the timing schedule now, actually. We'll just go back to, again, this is just the NCDPI accountability page, and then I click over here, testing students with disabilities. In the third one down, we see timing information for required assessments. We'll zoom in on that. This is included in the Testing Students with Disabilities document, and like you just saw on the web page, what this provides us with is just the standard times for the required tests. So the segment, how long they're working, the breaks, how many and how long, the total work time, and then the maximum time permitted. And so the goal of this document is just to inform teams of what the standard times are. So for example, looking at this BOG3 test, if I'm a teacher, if I'm an EC teacher and I know that these breaks happen every 30 minutes, then I may not say that we need breaks every 25 minutes for a student. Maybe you do and maybe you don't. But it's just to help provide some context for that team so that they know what the standard breaks and work times are. So this is just operationally, if a student takes a break and has an opportunity to access other people or devices, we need to be sure they're not going back to previously completed items, which I think makes sense. But if they take a break and do not have access to other people, like maybe they're just hanging out on one side of the room or going to the bathroom and they're not interacting with anyone else, then they can go back to those previously completed items. This scheduled extended time allows students to have extra time during that scheduled school day, unless they have multiple test sessions, in which case it can go over multiple days. I can't stress this part enough. Students must be allowed to eat lunch and go home. My first year here, I heard several terrible, terrible stories about students who were not able to eat lunch. And if I don't eat lunch, it's dangerous for everyone. So we need to be sure that students are able to eat lunch and go home, because those are far more important. Testing in a separate room. So we can group students in a separate room if they are using the same accommodation. So for example, if we have several students who need the test read aloud, or several students who need breaks every 20 minutes. But we could not group students together who have breaks every 20 minutes, and then this student has breaks every 40 minutes, and this, we can't, because that's just too much going on in a room. So we just need to, and the test coordinator typically handles all of this. But if you see something, say something. Monitoring accommodations, and we already had a question about this. The review of accommodations used during testing form kind of allows our, I always call this the Back to the Future form, because it allows our past self or our current self to talk to a future team. So it allows us to write what a student is supposed to get according to their documentation, what they are provided, if they used it, and then any anecdotal notes. So it kind of lets us, you know, our present day selves talk to our future selves about what a student may need. And this is just a screenshot of what that looks like, and then I also just showed you on the website where that can be found. So we're just gonna kind of fly through the North Carolina alternate assessments. These are for students. Actually, we'll go through each of these. The decision about whether or not a student should take the alternate assessment must be made and documented in the student's IEP at least 120 school days before the testing window. So that was new last year, so this year it's not so new. But bottom line is what is in the IEP must be followed. So there are certainly exceptions to this 120 school days guideline, because things happen and we know this. But whatever is in the IEP must be followed.
Okay, so just basically a comment. Is that a hard stop or best practice?
So the decision, and again, if we're doing this correctly, if we are truly using the eligibility criteria to look at the student's abilities, to think about their possible future options and their educational trajectory, then this should be a decision that's made one time and just reaffirmed each year. The goal of this 120 school day change is to ensure that schools are not flipping students on and off the alternate assessment, because the alternate assessment is based on the extended content standards. And so we want to be sure that the student has enough instruction in those extended content standards, or the general content standards if the switch is happening the other way. We want to be sure they have enough instruction using those standards to allow them to perform, to show us what they know on the assessment. And so again, those decisions must be made and documented in the student's IEP at least 120 school days before the testing window. But what is in the IEP must be followed. So I know that's kind of a roundabout answer, but in the world of EC, things are just like that.
Okay, so the 120 school day advance notice for alternate assessment is based on the extended content standards, but all decisions must be documented in the IEP.
Yeah, and you can, I mean, this is right from the documentation, okay, or the publication, I mean.
Okay.
So there will certainly be exceptions to this rule. We have students who unfortunately encounter very traumatic things that inhibit their cognitive ability. We have students who move in from other states. We have parents who understand what's going on with their child differently now than they have in the past. And so this 120 school days is to ensure that the student has enough instruction. But those cases should be so few and far between. This is certainly the rule. And just again, the student's IEP should always be followed. If the student's IEP indicates that he or she should take the alternate assessment, but it's dated fewer than 120 days prior to the testing window, the student would still take the alternate assessment. But any of these concerns should be discussed on a case-by-case basis with your EC coordinator and your testing coordinator, because again, these would certainly be exceptions to the rule. Any other questions about that?
Not so far.
We'll give just a, okay. Great. So we're just going to fly through this because I'm not sure, but if you have any questions about it, please let me know. The NC Extend 1 is the alternate assessment that is available for grades 3 through 8, 10, and 11 for those content areas. The eligibility criteria is listed here. It's also in the Testing Students with Disabilities publication. It's in the NC Extend 1 assessment guide, and it's listed on our webpage. Part of the eligibility criteria is explaining who the assessment is not for, and what we cannot base our decision on. And this is just a list of those things. This is an alternate assessment decision-making chart that's also available on our webpage. The North Carolina College and Career Readiness Alternate Assessments, those are available for students in grades 10 and 11. This is the alternate to the pre-ACT and the ACT. And the eligibility requirements are listed here. They're also in the Testing Students with Disabilities publication and in the CCRAA testing manual guide. This is that appendix that we already talked about with the timing information. So in the Testing Students with Disabilities publication, that is Appendix C, but it is also on the web page. Appendix I always like to point this one out because this one allows us to capture any errors that occur on the special print versions. And so this is kind of one of those things, if you don't tell us, we don't know about it. So if people see errors, you know, in their Braille version or their large print or their one test item per page or one of the other special prints that they may order using that special accommodation request, then this is located in the back of the Testing Students with Disabilities guide, and this is also included in all of the special print versions that are sent out. So if you see any errors, please let us know. And that's it. That's all I have. Again, that's my email address. My phone number, I'll say it again, is 919-807-3781.
Okay, I do have one question. Some districts have a new 504 coordinator role in PowerSchool. Can you tell us what that's for and what will that role allow and who should have that assigned? And last but not least, why don't all districts have it?
I'm not aware of a 504 role in PowerSchool. I don't know about the.
Okay. I don't have that answer for you, Francine, but I will look into it. So what I'm hearing you say is that there is a 504 coordinator role, but not everyone, not all districts have that role, and why is that role there, and why do we need it? So I'll have to look into that for you, Francine, and hopefully have some kind of communication sent out.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Not so much, not yet. We have about 9 minutes. Give me a couple minutes to keep typing here.
So as things come up, please feel free to either call me or email me so that we can work through issues.
You want to go back and show the PowerPoint? Because I added a couple things there.
Oh, sure. So I should switch it to you, right?
Okay, so I think I can do that now, because now I can grab it. I want to show the...
Yeah, show my screen. There you go.
Okay, so on this particular screen that you're seeing is the PowerPoint, and the second screen of it just shows you how to get to the accountability page, testing students with disabilities. The next slide has how you can get to the actual presentation that she was looking at, so the actual PowerPoint. It lives within that page under presentations. So if you get to that TSWD page, if you scroll down to presentations, this is what we're looking at today. And the last page, actually second to the last, has Amanda's name, her email, and her phone number. And then finally, if you needed to put in a remedy ticket, this is how to get to the portal and kind of what we need from you to put in that ticket. And there is a training video on how to enter a good, feasible ticket, and there's also a PowerPoint on that as well. We do have one more question.
Oh, no, that was
a couple of them. One is, will the PowerPoint be posted? This little PowerPoint, the little 4 or 5 slides, I can have Yolanda post it. It'll be under the PowerPoint. It'll be under the webinars, that part. But though the accountability one that Amanda was using, that will not get posted. You just have the ability to get to it from the webinar slides that I showed. And the other question actually is about accommodations.
Yeah, do you want to pass the, I'm sorry, I completely forgot about that one.
What is the new accommodation added or changed for EL?
Yeah, so there's no new accommodation for English learners, but I'll show you where that presentation is.
Okay.
And where that documentation is so that you can, there we go. Okay, good. So going back, so again, this is that accountability page. So before we were under here, testing students with disabilities. And the next tab under is testing students identified as English learners. So we would go there. Guidelines for testing students identified as English learners. So the document itself lives right there. Presentations right here, and this is just a PowerPoint. And I'll be honest, a lot of it is the same, and I felt like that was important because the information is the same. So the identification of English learners, LEs and charter schools need to identify them in a timely manner. All of this is going to come, all of this information will come from your EC coordinator or the program side of things, but we did want to include it here. Participation in the WIDA screener, which is for grades 1 through 12, or the WAPT, which is for kindergarten. That's based on the results of the home language survey. Eligibility for testing accommodations, those have not changed, and that's all listed here.
Okay, the one question that kind of is more direct is, my EL coordinator came to me yesterday and said that one changed. It had to do with reading aloud in English.
Yeah, and that's the one we've already talked about. It's instead of computer reads test aloud or test administrator reads aloud, it's just test read aloud in English. So that has changed for everyone. So the only accommodation that differs is, again, there's all that accessibility framework. is this one, the word-to-word bilingual English native language dictionary / electronic translator. That's the only accommodation that differs between students who are English learners and students who are identified as having a disability.
So what slide number is that? Does it have a slide number?
23.
The only item changed.
The only item
EL.
that's different between
different.
disabilities guidance and EL guidance is that one. That's the only accommodation. Well, and that's not actually true either, because there are some accommodations that are available to students with disabilities who are not available for students who are English learners. And so each of these documents are specifically for the groups that are listed on the front cover.
Okay. But if I tell them to look at slide 23 for the EL, it'll help a little bit with what's
or they can look at the web page that has the entire document listed, or which is right here, guidelines. You know, you can pull up this or the presentation itself.
Okay.
But all this information is listed here.
Okay. One more thing. Is there documentation showing how accommodations are entered in PowerSchool? I believe so, yes. There are QRDs, quick reference documents. Carol, I'll have to find where they live in NCSIS, because that's normally where they are found. I know that if we start with www.nc-sis.org, and then within there, you should be able to find QRDs, and I can't tell you the exact path because I kind of go through all different kinds of ways to get to it. But I know if you start with www.nc-sis.org and look for, maybe you can do a search in the upper right-hand corner and type accommodations, you'll see some QRDs listed for you. Okay, we got about 2 more minutes. How are we doing, folks? All right, when we do stop this recording, will get posted. I can't tell you exactly what day, but I'll do my best to convert it and send it. You will, when it does get posted, you will see it as part of the Friday bulletin that you get. Other than that, I think we are good. We are at 11:59. Any last comments? Awesome. Amanda, you were great.
All right. Thank you all so much. Have a great week.
All right. Bye, everyone.